And I'm sure we'll have a couple of other people show up. I know we had about 20 people registered, so we can go ahead and just kind of like get started with some icebreakers, I guess. Professor Skinner-Thompson, if you want to kind of talk about, I know you mentioned taking Spanish over the summer. If you wanted to talk a little bit about like what's your favorite thing that you've learned, we can get started there so people don't miss any of the content.
Oh, wow. Honestly, it's sort of fun just to be back in class again, but on the other side as a student. And one thing it has me thinking about, I'm taking the class pass fail, is uh, how much fun it is learning when there's no like pressure. uh, and it really has me thinking hard about grades and their educational purpose.
That's very true. That was the situation we ended up in my last semester of law school, where we all ended up being pass fail because of COVID. I know
Right.
it did take some of, I mean, obviously there were global pressures, the class pressure. It made class a lot more fun because it was less focused on trying to get the best grade and more just focused on the content and everyone having a good discussion and all of that stuff.
Totally.
Uh, and all right, well, the it looks like we may have a couple people who come in late, but that's okay. We can go ahead and get started. And we are recording, so there may be people who aren't able to join in person that we'll send the recording to after. But we are so glad to have you, Professor Skinner-Thompson. Thank you to those who are attending, and especially the team who has done a ton of reading for this to prep. So we are super excited to have you. And you are a professor at CU Law in Colorado and a professor of constitutional law. And I know you've taught civil rights in the past. So if you don't mind just giving us a little brief overview about your work and also the book, and if you don't mind sprinkling in a couple of things that are maybe just like what motivated you to get into this field, how did you get here? So we're very excited to have you. And if you don't mind starting us off with just a brief overview of how of your book and uh, all of the good stuff that I know that we're going to get into today.
Absolutely. And thanks so much, Corianne, and thanks to all of you for engaging with the book and having me. Corianne was a tremendous student, and it's really fun and awesome to see uh, alums like them out in the world, using their law degree to make an impact. So yeah, really honored to be here and grateful for the opportunity. So in terms of what I guess a good place to start. A lot of my work it focuses on privacy and or LGBTQ rights, and really my entry into that sort of intersection was when I was in practice doing a pro bono case. The ACLU came to the law firm I worked at the time, and they were looking to challenge a state that had policies that were restrictive when it came to changing the name or gender marker on people's identification documents, whether it be driver's license, birth certificates, what have you. And so we canvassed every state, and it turned out, and this is not uncommon, but somewhat surprising to me at the time, at least, was that Alaska actually has like really great state constitutional privacy law, and a lot of Western states constitutions are much more detailed and contain more specific Bill of Rights provisions, which stands to reason to a degree. I mean, given that the East Coast states, for example, most of their constitutions were created around the time of the nation's founding, and so aren't terribly dissimilar. So the Western constitutions tend to be a little more detailed, and a lot of them have explicit right to privacies in them. And there's also, I think privacy in some circles also like dovetails with this sort of libertarian ethos or ethic that you find in some Western states. And so we recommended that they bring a lawsuit under Alaska state constitution to Alaska's restrictive identification law, and they won. They got a decision saying that not allowing people to change their driver's license violated the right to privacy because it outed trans people anytime they were forced to present an ID that didn't correspond with their gender expression. So that's what really got me interested in this topic of sort of marginalized populations and privacy. And then I sort of built out my research. From there, continuing to focus on queer communities of which I'm a part, but also uh, marginalized communities more broadly. So the book really tries to bring together some of these threads, and it basically has tries to do four things. The first thing is just to lay out the legal landscape of privacy law, focusing primarily on constitutional privacy law, but also privacy tort law, which is private law. And in both instances, under constitutional law, which protects us vis-a-vis government actors, and privacy tort law, which protects us vis-a-vis, or in theory protects us private actors. Both strands of law have or both strands of law have a lot of precedent suggesting in terms of the legal landscape that privacy rights do not exist either in public spaces, so once you leave your home, or once the information at issue has been exposed to another. That is, as the book explains, legal privacy rights. So the ability to bring a claim saying your rights were violated is defined based on lived privacy, right? And so, the second intervention is to highlight the implications of that, the legal lived implications. That means if you are from a minoritized community and literally can't afford to build either the physical walls or the technical walls to keep your information secret, okay? If you don't have lived privacy ex ante and your information is exposed, right? If you don't have a home or you don't have a really great phone with security features, or can't or don't have the technical capital to protect yourself online, your information is more exposed, and once it's exposed, your privacy rights are diminished. They're not necessarily extinguished, but they're greatly diminished. And so this creates a feedback loop or a snowball effect where, in essence, the lack of lived legal privacy protections facilitates further lack of lived privacy for marginalized communities, and vice versa, causing material harm, meaning that like once information is exposed, more people can look at it, and once it's further exposed, more people can look at it, right? You have less and less legal privacy rights. They're defined, as one scholar put it, as in essence parasitic on each other. So how did we get to this point? Why are legal privacy rights defined so narrowly? So here in the book, I try to make the case that part of the reason that's the case is that privacy has been conceptualized, put as just as Rehnquist put it, privacy can be a coat of many colors. That means it can mean lots of different things to many people. And in legal discourse, it has been conceptualized historically pretty abstractly and universally as advancing, oh, it helps us get our thoughts together and then we can bring those into public. Oh, it helps us associate with each other. Oh, it helps us have dignity. It's been defined as having all these sort of abstract and indirect benefits. And I think that while all those things are true, I don't take issue with those definitions of privacy or explanations of privacy's value. Um, I think that uh, conceptions of privacy, for the most part, historically have um, underemphasized uh, privacy's ability to prevent concrete material harms, particularly for minoritized or marginalized uh, uh, communities, and that privacy itself is not just helping to facilitate thought and expression and ideas, but actually that when people take the time and effort, and no doubt it does take effort to protect your privacy this day and age, um, they are communicating something directly to those who are surveying them about the value of privacy and why they care about it. And so my intervention, sort of the fourth part of the book, is to explain why understanding privacy's both equality, or as I put it, anti-subordination dimensions and its expressive dimensions will lead to greater legal and societal protections for the privacy rights of marginalized communities. And part of that is based, you know, and this is truer today than when I wrote the book 3 or 4 years ago. The First Amendment is really one of the only rights that this Supreme Court seems to take seriously. And so I think there's a lot of value in educating the court and society in how privacy is directly expressing resistance. And I think that will pay dividends in terms of anti-subordination for the many minoritized communities who are trying to protect themselves from government and privatized surveillance. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, that was a great summary, and I love the way that you laid it out in the like four sections. And just you're so organized in your book, and the way that you use like headings and everything is very helpful. So just had to give a quick shout out to your writing skills
Right.
because I feel like we
Thanks.
all had something to learn there.
Thanks, Jonathan.
And I'm wishing that I had written a question, but I'm just going to sort of throw it at you because whenever you were talking about like that so much of this is built up around the judicial doctrine. This was something I was thinking about as I was reading as well. It's sort of a mismatch from how common like people who are using the internet are thinking about their own privacy rights. I feel like they're not thinking about the legal ramifications as like a judicial intervention. They're thinking of the laws. And then when we look at the laws, we don't really have that much backing from at least from Congress. So I feel like that was something that I don't know that you explicitly said in your book, but I feel like it was such an important theme that we don't have much in terms of like the legislative remedies. It is mostly coming from the court system, from the tort and constitutional lens, as you mentioned. So just I think, especially for maybe like Stacy and Brittany Ray, and Andy, who I know did not go to law school, I feel like that's kind of a helpful background. Is that like that is a separate uh, string of remedies like through the court versus through a piece of legislation where you can go to your state and bring a claim for discrimination or for a privacy harm, which we are starting to see in the privacy context in states. um anyway, sorry, got super excited about that. And then you
That's very interesting.
yeah, you also mentioned about the education piece and how people need to learn more about like privacy doctrine. And at NCC, we focus so much on having technical skills. So it seems like there is both a legal angle where people need to be more educated on their privacy rights, like what rights they do have, and also how do they technically protect those things? Like, do they need to buy a VPN? Is antivirus software already built into their computer? Like, all of these things are things that we see a huge need for on the public education side. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that sort of combination of
Well,
issues.
I totally agree. And I mean, honestly, if I were to prioritize, I'd say that the work on the tech education is more important than the legal education. I mean, like, and this is another part of the book is like, you know, I not trying to sell anybody snake oil that this is like the panacea, the privacy is going to solve all of our problems. The robust privacy rights are going to solve all of our problems, or that the courts and law are going to solve all our problems. Um, but uh, but I think that privacy rights can serve as a really important tool of harm reduction. And harm reduction is a concept, as I believe it originated in the public health context. I could be wrong about that, but that's the context where I am familiar with it, which says, like interventions, right, may not cure every illness, right, but they may reduce the harm. Um, they may not prevent everybody from getting in it, like, right, like wearing a mask may not prevent everybody from getting COVID, but it will reduce the risk, reduce the harm of people getting COVID. And so in that way, I believe privacy education, whether about your legal rights or about your tech savvy, is it going to mean that you have perfect privacy? No, that's not going to exist. But it can serve as a form of harm reduction, reducing the times or the volume of information that is exposed, right? And each time that happens, that's a good thing. That's a net benefit. I also think it's worth thinking about privacy, both in terms of legal costs, like from a surveiller standpoint, whether it's the government or a surveillance capitalist. From a surveillance standpoint, each legal hurdle that there is to obtaining information, or each technical hurdle that there is to obtaining information, so it reduces your harm reduction, but also raises the operating costs for that surveiller, right? Doesn't mean that the capitalist won't be able to find what they're looking for eventually. Okay. But if you're making it a little more difficult, you're raising their costs. And that's significant. In her book, Shoshana Zuboff sort of frames this as like the need to create friction for these companies, and I think that's exactly right. And I think another way of thinking about that is raising their operating costs, or raising the work that it takes them. May not be perfect, but it's a cog in the wheel, which can be a clog in the wheel, which can be significant.
Yeah, it seems very similar to the legal strategy in discovery of just like handing all the documents over to make it hard on the opposing counsel.
Right.
So I love that that is also getting used in the privacy context. And I know we've seen similar things with thinking about like Texas's reporting of women who have had abortions, and that there were ethical not hackers, because it's not hacking, but that went in and filled out the form over and over again to like shut down the technical portal. I think there are lots of technical resistance mechanisms that people are thinking really creatively about. So I love that little thread. And I also one thing you mentioned in your book that you just brought up that I thought was amazing, um and now I'm like completely blanking on what it is, but there was like it was such a tiny, oh, it was about technology and how it maximizes the amount of data that can be collected, and like these harms before in the analog context might have been, one off, or like one person might have seen the piece of paper, but when you have technology, I'm forgetting how you said it. I should have highlighted it, but you were talking about how it can compound the harm because it's on such a greater scale. So I thought that was awesome. And also want to leave room for other people to ask questions as well, if anyone else wants to jump in with one. I see Stacy going around the dock, so
Yeah,
I'll put you
I
on hot
think
seat.
thank you, because obviously I'm not a lawyer and I did not go to law school, and I'm trying to make sense of these things. And I think something for me that comes up as a consumer and just someone that is having to deal with this personally is like, what is AI gonna do to, the privacy concerns that we already have? Um, and where do you kind of see that, if more or less affecting marginalized groups at an increased rate compared to other communities? and the effect that AI is going to essentially have on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, I think that we don't know all the answers to this. One sort of concrete example, and AI, can mean different things, but uh, so the AI that's been getting a lot of attention lately are these large language models, right? These programs that have been trained on huge amounts of information and sort of dynamically answer questions that you pose to it based on that information. I mean, certainly we need some like rigid sort of rules, in my opinion, for some things. Like you shouldn't be able to, um, ask AI really intimate questions about people's lives, like what are all their addresses, things like that. Uh, where are they now? Like, um, uh, so I think for some of that we need rules, and the companies have put restraints on that themselves, but I think that needs to be legislated. I think the most sort of concrete example of where artificial intelligence, and this is, I think a similar where we need rules for this, hard command and control law, is facial recognition is a kind of artificial intelligence where you provide an image and then it's based on its library able to identify the individual, and Clearview AI is sort of the key example here. I think that facial recognition, I'm glad that some jurisdictions have done this, but certainly from a law enforcement perspective, like I think it just has to be banned. Woody Hartzog has been really outspoken about that, but I think it needs to be regulated more broadly too. I mean, you may have fooled around with these apps. Like if you have an object, I mean, they're like Google, they'll advertise this, right? Like I think the advertisement is like, oh, there's this really cool dress pattern. I want to find that dress. You take a picture of the dress, the internet will find it. I did this the other day. I, with my mom, had some old teapots, and I was trying to figure out like what they were. It's amazing. Like I was able to take a picture and then like find out what the deal is with this teapot based on an image. I mean, it's really remarkable. But if you're doing that with faces, it's a little more scary. And so I think we need some command and control rules regarding sensitive topics, sensitive information. And actually, Congress has been historically not bad at focusing on taking a sectoral approach to privacy, right? And saying, oh, certain kinds of information you just can't go after. Video rentals, right? Driver's license information. So they pass these very like narrow laws. And look, I think omnibus legislation would be good, but I think until we get there, we should sort of go for the low-hanging fruit. And again, that's a harm reduction approach. Like, what's the worst information? Let's make sure that can't be that everybody can sort of agree on, right? And this is what people in the feminist advocacy context have done with revenge porn too. Sort of take that sort of egregious, sensitive information and target that first. So I think there's some possibility for that in the AI space. I think that's necessary but not sufficient.
Thank you. And just kind of following up on that, do you think that there are certain marginalized communities that may be more at risk when we think about those things and the targeting of certain groups?
Well, definitely. I mean, this is I think it's a really good question and an important point, which is that all of these technologies will the marginalized, their data will be more accessible to surveillance, and in the first instance that they're more accessible. In the back end, they're going to be targeted more anyway, right? So like it compounds itself. So um, people um, people of color are disproportionately targeted by the carceral system. That means there's going to be more people of color with mugshots. If mugshots are being used for uh, artificial and facial recognition training, right? That means more people are going to be recognizable, and that means if a law enforcement department wants to go find a person, it's going to be easier because that person's already been trained in it, and so that it sort of cycles back on itself. And so the history of surveilling marginalized communities means that they're going to continue to be more accessible to these systems. Now, one caveat to that, which I think it relates to next century cities' important work in terms of broadband access, which is that so marginalized communities can be over surveilled. Okay, they can also be under surveilled and under under contacted, right? And so it's important to think about these things contextually. And I'm not trying to say like, it's great that rural communities don't have good internet access. Like, there may be some advantages to that, but I think Michelle Gilman has written really powerfully on this about sort of how in some contexts under surveillance, and this is true in like the health context, for example, like if we don't have enough health information data about minoritized communities, then they may not get the resources, or their health problems may not get the attention that um, uh, um, they deserve. And as you know, like when allocating scarce government resources, like having numbers is really important to making the public policy case.
Thank you. That was two incredible examples that really helped me kind of solidify that. So thank you.
Of course.
Yeah. One of the things I was going to jump in with is on the technology side, we're seeing a lot of communities that are having like software shoved down their throats that's using AI. And it's just like, we don't know, Stacey and I don't know the legal side of things like this. And a lot of communities and people making the decisions on buying software don't have that technology experience and knowledge and understanding what they're getting into. And what privacy concerns may be out there that they've not even considered when buying this software, whether it's used for law enforcement, for surveillance, to review legal cases, which ones to put forward, which ones not to. We're all even seeing software out there to decide that to build out proposals and to decide proposals on zoning, things that come in, run zoning or permitting, all those types of things. Just curious if you have thoughts around that and how communities can better inform themselves as they're being like, as software is kind of being thrown at them. Hey, this is the best, neatest, and newest thing to use for your communities.
Yeah, well, it's a real double-edged sword, isn't it? And I don't know that I have a great answer, but as you were talking, it sort of reminded me of again another pandemic example. You know, and pre-pandemic too, but like Google was really generous in like rolling out a lot of its software and hardware to public schools. And the very parallel, right? Access, okay? Making sure that students have access to technology, particularly when they're going to be doing remote education. Laudable goal. What are the terms of this? What does Google learn? What's Google getting out of this? Like, what are they learning about students? Maybe some of what they're learning is really helpful in terms of enhancing education. Maybe they are, in effect, trying to capture the market and expose, get students and kids exposed to their platforms and their interfaces so that they're hooked going forward. So I think it's really parallel, and I don't have a good answer, except for that, I think it's individual. This is where individuals, if they have the savvy to resist, to engage in forms of obfuscation that Helen Nissenbaum has sort of documented in her work, great. But individuals alone aren't gonna be able to stop this. We need governments, we need NGOs who are stepping in and negotiating the terms of that service for those communities, because individuals, and it's like tough. I mean, actually, this is like very timely. I've had people from Quantum come to my house the last 2 days to talk to me about like switching over to their services, and I'm like moderately sophisticated, but it's really hard to know, but particularly when they're one is just it was like I need to think more about this, but like we're not used to salespeople, or I'm not used to salespeople, like, and I was like, oh my God, like it just sort of like catches you off guard. I'm like, oh, this guy is like here, like um it's you feel vulnerable. And so, right, and if I'm feeling that way, like, other people are feeling that way, too. So that's why I think your work is really important, right? We need access, but we need access on terms that are advancing equity, not sort of perpetuating inequity.
That also makes me think of like the choice factor, because you're talking about the Google and the public school systems, and those students don't get a choice in who is accessing their data, if they are, how long they're keeping it, who is looking at it. Like, you brought up another issue for me, which is just thinking about like individuals' rights in that way. When we think about the privacy, I mean, the school systems create those contracts, and students have to fall within, the decisions that they make. And what does that mean for their individual personal privacy, or even family members in the home when they take those devices home that don't attend those public schools? And so those school systems don't really get to determine how they use those things or the data that they collect. But I'm assuming that they are collecting something on more than just the student if they're at
Yeah,
their
I think it's a great point, and I'm not totally, I think part of it's going to be driven by contract. The school is limited by FERPA, but FERPA really only covers certain narrow sets of information, and it probably doesn't apply directly to the private company in it either.
Ryan and Brittany Ray, did you have anything you wanted to ask? I didn't mean to leave you out if you had something. You're on mute.
I thought I clicked the button. Hi, Professor Skinner-Thompson. My name is Ryan Johnston. I'm the other Senior Policy Counsel here at MCC.
Good to meet you.
And it's a pleasure to meet you. One of the things that I've been kind of thinking about fairly consistently over the last couple of weeks is how far the Loper-Bright decision is going to kind of work its way through the administrative agencies. Is that something that you've given any kind of thought about, as to how that kind of step back to like what is essentially Skidmore deference with the agencies might have an impact on how we do things like privacy, how we think about those things going forward?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. You asked about Loper, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wish my better half was here. He could answer this more completely than I could. My husband teaches administrative law, used to work at the EPA, so this is the forefront of his mind. So what would Jonathan say? I think Jonathan would say that here's what I would say. Loper is a big deal. So, and just to back up for those who maybe, I mean, maybe everybody's familiar with this, but so there's this case Chevron. It's a 40-year-old case that said that when Congress passes a statute and the statute is ambiguous, the language of the statute is ambiguous, then when agencies are interpreting the statutory language to implement the statute, they are entitled to deference in their interpretation. Supreme Court in Loper said no. Quoting Marbury versus Madison, this old Supreme Court case that's sort of canonical. They said it's our job the court's job to say what the law is. We have to go with the best interpretation of the statute, and we don't have to defer to agencies. So what does that mean? It means that agencies, when they're implementing statutes, are going to have to guess about what they think the best interpretation is, or at least what the court thinks that interpretation is, even though there may be more than one interpretation, right? Language is susceptible to multiple meanings. So it's going to limits agencies' wiggle room, okay? They're not going to have as expansive mandates. And that's true whether we're talking about environmental law or privacy law, or FTC, or FCC. I will say, and in the long run, what this means is that Congress is going to have to do more work. Congress is going to have to be more specific, which may mean Congress is doing even less, because if they have to reach agreement on specific things, they're less likely to reach agreement. Leaving things vague sometimes helps reach agreement. I think Loper is undoubtedly is going to reduce the power of the administrative state. I will say, I think that Loper is way less, it could be worse, is what I'm going to say. It could be worse in that the Supreme Court has not yet it hasn't revived yet the non-delegation doctrine, which is a doctrine that existed in about 100 years ago, that said, Congress can't delegate its power to the executive branch. Right? That's more or less been dead, and but certain justices on the court want to revive it, and that would be a much more significant blow to the administrative state, in my opinion, because not only would you be saying that, okay, agencies under Loper, agencies can still implement the legislation, they just have to do so consistent with the judiciary's interpretation, not their own deferred to interpretation. If the court goes after non-delegation or revives non-delegation, then query whether they're allowed to do any sort of implementing or interpreting at all. It's not a very satisfying answer, all of which is to say, again, Loper is bad, but maybe in the long run, at least the medium term, it's a significant enough reduction in the power of the administrative state that maybe the more moderate justices, like Roberts, won't be like, all right, we need to revive non-delegation.
Right. And I think that's a good point to bring up too, especially because there's a case came down from an en banc rehearing from the Fifth Circuit yesterday, Consumers Research versus the FCC, that specifically dealt with Congress's intent to delegate basically a fee structure to the FCC, and then the FCC delegated that out to a quasi-private entity. The chairman of the FCC said she's going to appeal that to the Supreme Court. So there may be a delegation question heading to the Supreme Court before too long.
Don't appeal it.
So that'll be it'll be interesting to see whether or not they actively take that up. But one of the things that I think is tied to this is how do we, because when we look at privacy, we're often looking at like equal protection clause issues. We're often looking at things that would probably generally fall under the purview of like the major questions doctrine. How prevalent do you think that those kinds of conversations will be now that we are kind of moving away from agency deference and towards, does the statute say this? Can we do this under the statute? That those kinds of, things that would generally fall under major questions.
Yeah, and so I think it's another, I mean, and again, the major questions doctrine is another new invented rule by the Supreme Court that basically says where the agencies are trying to answer big questions, okay, Congress has to do it. Agencies can't do it, right? Interpretive questions. So it's a similar move to Loper. And so, yes, there are all these like different ways of reducing the power of the administrative state that are percolating. Do I see major questions limiting privacy rulemaking? Yeah, I can see it. Yeah, and I'd be interested to know if you know offhand, like whether or not this has come up at all in like FCC or FTC litigation.
I don't think it's come up yet, but I'm almost certain that it will probably come up soon.
No, I think it's something, I think you're smart to have your eye on that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate all your answers. I know that I asked some kind of like out of left field questions, so I appreciate
No,
it.
it's great. It's great. Yeah.
I wanted to know if you plan to expand your research. I know that you're looking at transgender rights, but would your research expand, or has it expanded? I know it's been a few years since you first released this publication, to look at how these things touch communities with intersectional identities.
Well, definitely, and thanks for the question. And it's something I try to gesture to in the book, but probably could give some more fulsome attention to. But absolutely, like the way and part of this is linguistic and for efficiency reasons, but it's absolutely critical to think about these questions of privacy rights from an intersectional lens. And I think Kiara Bridges' work really does an outstanding job of this. So, her work is focused on sort of what are the privacy harms of not just women, but Black women, and not just Black women, but economically disadvantaged Black women, right? And she's done a deep dive into like systems of Medicare and the surveillance of these women's health and the ways in which they're policed when they're pregnant and viewed as suspicious by social service providers. And so 100%, I think when thinking about privacy problems, you can't approach them from a single dimension, and need to be extremely attentive to the intersection. I think when it comes to trans people's privacy and the carceral state and sex work and people of color, I think it's another context. We talk about trans rights often in a very flat way, but not all trans people are similarly situated vis-a-vis the state. If you're a white trans woman who quote unquote passes as cis, life can be pretty great, right? Life can be pretty great for anybody, of course, but your relationship to the state and surveillance is very different than trans sex worker who's a person of color, right? And we know this from examples, right? There are prominent white trans women in the Biden administration who've reached sort of the pinnacle of their careers and power, and they're not similarly situated to other trans folks. So I think it's a critical question. It's something that I've addressed in a piece I wrote called Identity by Committee, which focused on the regulation of of gender identity in public schools, and it basically This article is actually focused on sort of not the anti-trans school districts. It's focused on the pro-trans school districts. And so a lot of the policies that have been implemented at the behest of some of the more prominent mainstream LGBT rights organizations are policies that try to give students, try to acknowledge students' gender identity, but they're highly bureaucratized. So, you know, a student may have to submit a gender support plan, right, to a school, and may have to go through all this bureaucratic paperwork to have their identity recognized and submit a bunch of medical evidence or parental support documents. And in that article, one thing I try to point out, among others, is that these systems, or what I call them, identities by committee, right? Because there's literally sometimes committees deciding whether a person is who they say they are. That they burden all students, but they do not burden all students equally, and that students whose parents aren't supportive, students whose parents may be supportive but don't have the social capital, the time off work to navigate these bureaucratic systems, are going to be even more disadvantaged, and they're just not going to be accessible to them. And other scholars, I think, have made similar important points. Latasha Baldwin Clark, for example, has pointed out how, you know, our disability rules in schools similarly not accessible to those who basically, you need a parent whose full-time job is advocating for the kid in the public school system. And if, you know, you're if you're a person of color who's maybe only has one parent, and they're working overtime to you know, keep food on the table, right? It's going to be difficult to navigate that vis-a-vis a rich rich trans kid with two parents, right? So absolutely, I think like being attentive to these nuances is really critical ex ante. And in all fairness, you know, to these LGBT rights organizations that I mentioned and the policies they've sort of promulgated, I think it's easier to see these burdens after the fact, once policies are being rolled out. It's more difficult to see them ex ante. But this is why in lawmaking and policy making, it's really important to, when you're creating a policy, make sure that those involved in that decision-making process are representative of myriad intersectional identities.
I'm curious where HIPAA comes into this. My mind just is screaming this, you know, as parents, you know, families have to put all this documentation together, or even for women that have to go out of state to seek abortion, or, you know, or seek assistance. Where does HIPAA come into any of this that protects people?
Well, HIPAA, a lot of these, you know, and this gets back to what Congress has been good at and what they've been bad at. I mean, they take this sectorial approach, right? Health information, education information, right? So it's narrow, and it really only applies to a handful of entities, right? HIPAA applies to healthcare providers and a few other entities. FERPA applies to schools, but, you know, really just certain kinds of information. And, you know, it's important to distinguish between like external disclosure and internal disclosure. Internal disclosure can still be really broad, you know, in terms of a school, community.
And I do have one more question for you that I can't believe we made it this far into this conversation without asking, about the definition of harm. Like, as we've been talking about harm, and I know particularly with if you have like someone who's about to be incarcerated, like there's a very direct harm if they're using algorithmic sensing, and there's data that's being used for that. But what about some of these examples where the harm is more difficult to see, I guess, and the courts aren't usually as good at identifying or like quantifying those harms. Are there, I guess, how have especially the anti-trans laws, have they like changed how you're thinking about this, or do you see a good path forward for like quantifying harm in a way that courts uh, can acknowledge it and I guess appreciate it for the hurt that it's causing?
So great question. I mean, I think, and this is again harm reduction. Like, I'm most interested in solving the worst harms. Um, the low hanging fruit, so to speak, but we haven't even done that yet. So I think that's where we have to start. And then, yeah, I think we need to educate on risks that flow from more ethereal forms of harm and the potentiality of more concrete harm. And this is where, litigation strategy comes into it, plaintiff selection, right? Part of winning cases is telling compelling stories. And so I think, telling stories to courts, telling stories to the public about how their information, it may seem ethereal and not a big deal abstractly, but tell stories about when that information has been abused and led to concrete harm. And it doesn't really take that many steps. And I think the public is actually, even the Supreme Court, as I mentioned in the book, like they can see themselves in some of these problems, right? Like in cases dealing with warrantless searches of cell phones, right? They're like, oh God, if you saw my cell phone, I mean, Justice Alito wouldn't want his text with his wife being made public, right? Like, and I'm not making a sexual joke. I'm talking about, I don't know if you've been following this, that they're not my flags, they're her flags. They're right. Like um, which reminds me of the like Kavanaugh confirmation trial. He's like, I like beer, so sue me. And then, the Alito defense is like, I like flags, so sue me. Where is this being? This is being recorded. Where is this going? This being posted publicly. But it's she's not responding, or they're not responding. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. We can cut this part out if you want, or
Okay.
yeah, we can do just the beginning part. Stacy is our expert like cutter, so
Okay.
I will defer to her on where to cut it off.
Great. Will this be posted publicly or?
Yeah, so we did have around like 20 people sign up for
Yeah.
the event today. And so we will send it to everyone who registered. And then we usually just like put it out on our social medias. And so, we had a great conversation. Would love for you to take a listen, and we'll link to the book as well.
Cool. Thanks. I lost the thread a little bit, but I think the point being that Supreme Court justices care about their privacy too, right? They don't want their political activity, to the extent they're engaged in it, being made public.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on that, but I agree with you. I'm sure that they absolutely don't. It might be great for some of us to know what's
Right.
going on, but yes, privacy extends to those that have that power as well.
Well, and there's this is not in the book, but in subsequent writing, like there was such an irony with Dobbs, right? Like they are literally taking away people's ability to control their own bodies, right? Stripping away a fundamental right to privacy. And then when the opinion is leaked, Justice Roberts issues this sort of just a gas statement, right? Like, how could you invade our privacy like this? And it's like, no recognition, no understanding of the irony.
Well, it's their privacy that is being
Exactly,
attacked, not anyone else's. So they can clearly see it in that
Clearly
regard.
see it, yeah.
And I know we're running low on time, so if you had any final thoughts, happy to wrap it up here if you don't, but if you do want to like give a little what's next for you and your research, that would be a great place to leave it off.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. I mean, I'm really, my last few pieces have been pretty squarely focused on trans rights, and my current piece is trying to push back on this idea that advocating for legal recognition of trans people is pushing some sort of gender ideology on people. So it's called Law's Gender Ideology, and it sort of explains how, well, cisnormativity is an ideology that's been pushed on everybody, and recognizing the existence of trans people isn't going to turn everybody trans, but at the same time also pushing back a little bit on trans legal advocates who have said gender is always fixed. It's just fixed in the brain, not the genitals, because I think that's an overreaction too. I think, I mean, and this, without getting too much into the weeds of the biology, social science, and theory, I believe that gender is born, but it's also made, and so riffing off that Simone de Beauvoir quote, one is not born a woman, one becomes one. And I actually think like we need to be careful in like the idea, the gender ideology grooming narrative is awful and needs to be pushed back on. At the same time, we need to recognize that for some people, gender is not a static thing, and allow for exploration.
And like sexuality, it's not binary, right?
Exactly.
It may not be binary. Yeah. So
exactly.
yeah.
As a gender fluid person, I appreciate that as well. Like I see so much of the argument between like trans and cis people ends up ignoring the point that it's really about personal identity and not about other people telling you what your identity is. So I appreciate that, and I'm excited to read it. And just thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. I know all of us were really like geeking out, or at least Ryan and I were geeking out in our DMs talking about the article in the book. So thank you so much for everything you've written on this, and
Well,
also just for
it's such
taking
an
the
honor
time.
to be here, and thank you again to all of you for your incredible and important work.
Yeah, thank you for your time. This has been wonderful.
It was very nice to meet you. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
likewise. Stay in touch. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Take care.
Take care.